So I think for me, it's helping us all be more aware of the way that trauma is ever present with us in almost all of the spaces that we occupy, and learning to be better responders to that. How do we, de-escalate a moment? How do we make amends? How do we care for people in particular ways when they're struggling?
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Matt and Lucy Mind the Gap. I'm Lucy, pronoun she, her, and I'm so glad you're joining us today for another important conversation, this time about how we can reshape our work environments to prioritize mental health and create trauma-informed workplaces.
And I'm Mad, pronouns she, her. Today's episode is all about the intersection of mental health, workplace culture, and the growing need to support employees as whole people. This topic feels more urgent than ever, and we're thrilled to explore it with our guest.
Yes, back for a second time is the brilliant and insightful April Hennessey, who is Blanchard's Director of Strategy and Transformation, DEI Practice Lead, educator, and school board trustee, in addition to being a Leadify thought leader and advocate for trauma-informed workplaces. Am I missing anything?
Nope,
April, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us again. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Happy to have you here. So, April, let's start with the basics. For those who might not be familiar with the term, what does it mean to have a trauma-informed workplace? And actually, now that I think of it, maybe we should go back a step even and define what we mean when we use the word trauma.
I think that's great because, we kind of throw this word around a lot, but I don't think that everybody is always clear on what it means and who it impacts, right? So interestingly, trauma is not defined by the event, although there are events that we might consider traumatic. Trauma is actually defined by the response in the individual who experiences it. So two people may experience the same event. One person may, experience that as traumatic and another person might not. So typically we say it occurs when a person is overwhelmed by events or circumstances and responds with intense fear, horror, or a sense of helplessness. And so it really is about what that person's response to the event is. But I would say beyond that, we can sort of broaden our definition of trauma to think about the various kinds of trauma that can exist in a space. So you might have individual trauma, and that's just an event that happens to a person. You might also have vicarious trauma. So this is often like if you're a bystander in an event, you're not actually on the receiving end of a traumatic incident necessarily, but you witness it. And sometimes we think about vicarious trauma in like accidents, sometimes in domestic violence instances and things like that. And then we have started to talk more lately, although it's always sort of been around, about collective trauma. And so one of the things that I've talked about recently in terms of collective trauma is like COVID. COVID was in many ways a collective trauma for people, thinking about everybody being sheltered in their homes, people not having access to things that they need, loved ones dying and not being able to have access to them. That was a source of collective trauma that we experienced together. And I think the workforce has really demonstrated what that collective trauma has done. But, think about like even World War I and the conversations about shell shock, right? It was the first time that people really talked about a kind of big collective traumatic event, I think, with a label or a title. We would later come to think of that as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. But we've been dealing with trauma, collective trauma, and things like that for a very, very long time. It's just taken different shapes over time.
I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it definitely feels it feels like the language affords us more ways to talk about the issue and to actually like do something with it, rather than just being like, we're all broken and we need to just kind of hide that and, quietly work through it, or we don't. And we pay the consequences of that. But I imagine that when we talk about like a trauma-informed workplace, we're thinking about how do we avoid like the alternative, right? Would you maybe want to tell us a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah. So, some of the statistics that we have say that 70% of adults in the US have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their lives. So that's roughly like 223 million people have experienced some form of trauma at some point in their life. We also know that it's a risk factor in nearly all behavioral health and substance use disorders, and that things like mental health conditions and things like that might be closely affiliated with trauma can cost employers in the United States up to like $193 billion in lost earnings due to absenteeism and presenteeism, right? So presenteeism is when you're there, but you're not connected, you're not plugged in, you're coming to work. Absenteeism is when people are out because of something that is related to a mental health condition, which may or may not be influenced by trauma, but often we find that they have traumatic underpinnings. So there's lots of impact to not having a trauma-informed workplace, or at least to not understanding. There's this one phrase that or this term that I think is really interesting, and it came from this piece called Trauma-Informed Workplaces, Concept, Strategies, and Tactics to Build Workplaces that Support Well-Being, and it was put out by the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. That's a mouthful. But they really, in there, they talk about this physiologist who's also sort of works as a psychologist in the 1930s named Walter Buchanan. And he talks about biocracy. And so he kind of describes a hypothetical society modeled after the human body. So he likes to think about societies, or in this case, they're saying organizations can be seen as a biocracy. And basically this concept that the organization is seen as a living system, right? Think about all the pieces and all the cells, which would be all the people working in this body, and that the organization can actually become ill and they can recover. And we've seen this in organizations, right, in different ways. And so I really love this sort of notion of biocracy and the fitness of an organization. How fit is your organization? And I think a big part of that is accounting for mental health and well-being and stuff like that, but also being trauma informed, like understanding how trauma has a ripple effect in people's lives, that extended childhood trauma can lead to increased chronic illness, that it can lead to all sorts of other, what we call like comorbidities. And so understanding that is a foundation for how we then address our employees and create policies that might support them.
So one of the questions that I've been thinking about as I kind of get a little more educated about this is, how is this different, April, from, all the work I know you're doing, but also that we generally do at Blanchard, right? Working with managers and leaders, helping them to see the value of increasing their ability to respond to coworkers, but also direct reports with empathy, leading with empathy. So how is this different from that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think empathy is a foundation for trauma-informed care. If we don't have empathy for people and their experiences, then we're already failing out of the gate. But beyond that, a lot of times you can have empathy and not know what path to take next. So imagine you have someone who is in the midst of a mental health crisis or has experienced trauma, and they're sitting in front of you and they are sort of in shambles. You can have a whole bunch of empathy for them, and that's a really good starting point, and yet not know what the next steps are that you can take as a leader or a manager or a coworker to support them or to ensure that they get the care that they need. Knowing that we have policies for people who are in crisis, or knowing that people have access to mental health days or wellness days or flexible working time. That's a huge one when it comes to trauma-informed workplaces. Flexible working days, the ways that they can use their PTO. I mean, I've seen organizations say, you may not use your sick leave for anything other than illness. And so you may not be well on a day, but you may not be physically ill. And in that case, you wouldn't be able to use your sick leave, right? And if you don't have enough PTO accrued, you're in a really weird and tight spot. And so that I would say is not a trauma-informed workplace policy. And as a manager, you might have empathy for them, but you're all kind of stuck in this system that's like, what can we do? So I think it's really important for organizations to look at their policies and understand, what does it mean to be trauma-informed? What supports can we offer the people who are in leadership positions so that they know what next steps are? And what policies do we have that are flexible enough that support a wide range of needs that people experience and aren't so constrained by, you must be physically ill, you must be this, it must be that, or else?
Yeah, so it's like we've created these systems that don't really allow people to be people.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think there can be an assumption sometimes that like we as people can create things that are neutral. But I think more the reality is that we're people. So everything that we create inevitably is fed by our experiences, by our education, by everything that we bring to the table. And I think, there are ways we can kind of control that and channel it in different ways. But ultimately, like, it's this question of, can we really create something neutral, a system that it applies to everyone? The reality is everyone's different. And the people who are creating the systems are just as different as the people that they're creating the system for. So I think that makes a lot of sense thinking about it that way.
Absolutely.
Well, even going back to what you said earlier, April, that I never really thought about, and I think is important, that the distinction isn't, did you experience a trauma or something that would be defined as traumatic, versus were you traumatized by something?
Yeah.
And maybe somebody else barely even noticed.
Right. And so the way that we're wired, our anxieties and those things that feed into those different moments, they just get processed differently in our brains because all of our brains are different. So I think that that's always a really important thing to remember. So I'm glad you called that out. The other thing that I will say is that PTSD, for instance, is actually protected under the ADA. But it's one of those things that people don't disclose because there's still so much stigma. And I think a lot of times people think, I'm going to have to disclose what that trauma is, or people are going to ask me about it, or they're going to think something about me if I disclose this. It's different when you're like, oh, I have blank illness, or I have this. Like, maybe it's not easier always, but in some ways it's clear cut to say I have a condition. But it's one of those things that people often don't report and ask for support from their employers with. So I think even just having policies on the books that are specifically labeled as trauma-informed policies or trauma-informed, things can open up spaces for people to be more authentic about those things.
Would you be willing to kind of share what got you so interested in this? Because on top of all the other stuff that Lucy listed, you've also recently earned a professional development certificate in trauma-informed care. Mm-hmm. Talk about a mouthful, from IU. So, but what makes this so personal to you?
Yeah, I definitely experienced a great deal of trauma as a kid myself. But I've also, and I think as a result, it means that I've been in lots of spaces with people who have also been impacted by trauma, or who have varying degrees of traumatic responses. And it's always interesting for me to see, even if you lived in the same household or you were part of the same organization that had created the root of that trauma or whatever it is, that everybody's experience of that is different and the impact to their lives are different. So thinking about what I've experienced and some people who maybe have experienced some of that alongside me, there are people who are in jail, there are people who are unhoused, there are people who have issues with addiction, and there are people who disavow any impact whatsoever. And so I think when it's important because trauma and their responses do not always look the same in every person. And so sometimes we expect it to look one way. And I think it's important to educate people on the wide range of realities of trauma. And secondly, I think it touches all of us. So whether or not we were impacted personally, vicariously, collectively, at this point, trauma touches all of us. And if we're in a workplace with people who have experienced trauma, we need to be sensitive to that, right? In schools now, we do a lot of trauma-informed work. We do social emotional learning to teach kids how to respond to one another. Like, look at this person's face. What is their face saying right now? Like, look at this person's body language, right? And those are things that many of us didn't learn in our schools, that kind of intentionality and emotional intelligence of observing people's responses and behaviors. And so what can happen sometimes in a workplace when you're with other people is that you might accidentally step on think about it like a landmine or something, right? You might accidentally step on that with an offhanded comment or remark. And before you know it, this person is really upset. Maybe they're crying, maybe they're stomping off, maybe they're mad. And you're like, what the heck just happened? So I think for me, it's helping us all be more aware of the way that trauma is ever present with us in almost all of the spaces that we occupy, and learning to be better responders to that. How do we, de-escalate a moment? How do we make amends? How do we care for people in particular ways when they're struggling? And then also to be aware of those things in ourselves, because some people actually will come to their trauma knowledge later. And they're like, oh, I feel those things, or, oh, I've experienced that, or, don't you all just get a little shaky when someone yells in the room? And it's like, well, maybe, and maybe not. And maybe there's some trauma there that you haven't dealt all? With. I don't know. I think maybe and maybe not. So I don't know, Mad.
But then again, I worked at an investment bank in New York, and it's astonishing how much time I spent crying in the ladies' room. And I guess I still think that was normal. Those people were just mean.
Yeah, but see, even that is like workplace trauma. I also want us as an organization and other organizations to know how not to create trauma for people, right? Like, you don't want to be creating workplace trauma for people in your organization.
Oh, I'm pretty sure that organization. I'm 100% sure. Because you know what? I became really good friends with the person who was the senior client. Mm-hmm. And we were having dinner one night, and we had a little bit of wine. And I said, oh, this is hysterical, right? But I really started to believe that it was an agreement amongst all of you people at the organization to torture the consultants and see if you could make them quit. And she said, oh, no, we actually had contests.
Wow. Okay.
So
right?
Maybe they need some workplace training on how to be trauma informed, and also maybe not bullies.
Yeah.
But I do think, like, at a certain point in our sort of collective history, certain kinds of workplace behaviors were acceptable. Even if you go back and watch TV shows from like the 90s or the 80s, like I watch them and I'm like, oh, we could never get away with that now. Like, we could not do that, right? Because we've learned that those things are called harassment or like a host of other things. Like, we can't do those things anymore. Yeah. We don't want to be those orgs. We don't want people going off and telling stories about us later. And we have really some great policies at Blanchard. And especially in the past few years, I think, there's been an extra push for really thinking about people's well-being and mental health in ways that aren't just sort of trite and check the box ways. And I think Blanchard's always been committed to that, I think, since the beginning, since its inception in many ways, right? And that's evident in the content. It's evident in so many of the other pieces and players and things like that. But there's always room for us to learn and grow a little bit more.
So thinking about sort of my own generation, kind of the things that I've witnessed around us being sort of educated on things like emotional intelligence, and even this idea of like, we're all different, we have different experiences, so we should be empathetic to one another, at least as sort of that baseline. That's something that I've sort of seen sort of taught both directly and indirectly to me, like throughout my life, that maybe is different from other generations, but it can be, it presents its own challenges, right? Because we go from having this sort of environment and education spaces where it's like, be who you are and be proud of who you are, and people will accept you and be kind to one another. Like all those sorts of things that maybe come across as idealistic once you maybe enter, the adult working world, where you're surrounded by people of all different kinds of generations who maybe have different perspectives on what's acceptable workplace behavior and like the differences between, rites of passage versus harassment or even just bullying and teasing. Just thinking about how do we as a generation who expects something different or has been used to something so different, how can we kind of practically cope through that without sort of just being like, well, that's just the way that it is, and I kind of just have to deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard one, I know, because a lot of times you're already feeling really vulnerable being young, being new, being, most junior in a space, and it can feel really daunting. I think, we've had a lot of funny models online and on social media. I'm thinking about like, the threads that circulated for a while about like the intern and her elder colleagues who would come to her and say like, am I allowed to say vibe check? Or what does it mean when I say blank? And they sort of like fill in the blanks. I think there are ways for us to begin to educate and to drop that kind of stuff into conversations as education points. I think others will be on board with, right? So you'll have your millennials or your zennials or your Gen Xers or whoever, even your boomers and your like, I think there are people in each generation who are going to be willing to go there with you, right? And like we talk about virtue signaling, and you don't want to be a virtue signaler, but I do like to signal to people that I am a safe place to have those conversations, right? So whether it's sharing a particular meme or something that's like, oh, about your therapy bestie, or whether it is putting on my calendar that this is my therapy appointment during the week, and I don't care who sees it, or when I told my team that I was going to do an EMDR intensive, which is directly, sort of known to have impacts and effects for individuals who have trauma. Like, I sort of been just very open about that, right? And I don't need to get super personal about it, and I don't need to tell them all the details, but I can certainly say those things. Or, oh, yeah, actually, one of the things that I've been talking about with my therapist is the neuroscience of trauma. And so we can kind of talk about that. But the more you kind of drop those nuggets in, the more you'll discover the people who are willing to have those conversations with you. So I would just say, don't shy away from it. Put it into your everyday, because the more we begin to talk about it, the more people will jump on board and the more conversations we can have. And then also, like, you'll find your allies, the people who are willing to sort of be in there with you and say, yeah, these things are really important. We should be thinking about these things, and how are they impacting you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I am a boomer. And, back in my day, anytime something surfaced, right, where people were behaving badly, essentially in the workplace, it was toughen up.
Yes.
Grow a thicker skin. Get over it. And I did. I grew a thicker skin, right?
Yeah.
And I did toughen up. But I don't think I got over it. And I think, if anything, to me, it was such a good role modeling for what I didn't want to be, when I became a boss.
Yeah, I think that that's so true. And I think when there's like, oh, there's no tears in baseball, or like all the things that essentially are like, we don't do those things. We just suck it up. You move on. Right. And actually people see that as a sign of strength. And I will just say, I don't actually think it is. I think it is so much easier to just tuck it away somewhere and move on, because you don't have to deal with the implications, the impact, the fallout. It is much easier than having a hard conversation or dealing with that thing that impacted you. Doing the trauma work myself and knowing people who've had to do this work, it is no joke. And it is not for the faint of heart, right? It would be much easier for us to just put it away, not think about it, not talk about it, just do our everyday, right? It takes enormous amounts of energy and strength and courage to wade into that stuff. And it's kind of like we talk about even in like conversational capacity and things like that. When we minimize things, when we back away from them, we're not actually landing in a good spot. We are not then in the sweet spot, right? We are so outside of that. And so I think it's important for us to understand that while those things are out there and there's still mentalities that a lot of us have internalized, like even myself, I'm like, oh, don't cry, suck it up. Don't be a baby, right? But like, we have to reframe how we think about those things. And I think we have to reframe, those emotional responses not as weak, but just as real. And we do the things that we need to do with them in the moment. Sometimes we face them, sometimes we put them away for later, but not because there's anything shameful about them, but just because they're things that have their place in any given moment and things that we have to just manage differently at different times. So yeah, I think it's all about reframing how we look at those things. And frankly, it's women often who get those aspersions sort of cast our way. Ugh, here she comes again with her hormones crying or whatever it is.
Well, and I think there's kind of two responses, right? It's like notice my own experience and learn from it and don't create those experiences for other people. Mm-hmm. And then the opposite reaction, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this when I teach coaching skills in organizations is I was hazed within an inch of my life. I fought tooth and nail to get where I am. And why should I make it easier for people who come after me? I had to fight. Why shouldn't they have to?
Isn't that the point though? Like, didn't we have the women's rights movement and like the civil rights movement and all of the, like people fought for like generations so that things could be easier, right? I think like we forget the whole point of doing that work and that labor is so that the people who come after us can have an easier access point into those things that we had to claw our way tooth and nail into. And I think it is hard, right? When you've done all of this work and you're like, why should I have to do this? And why was this my experience and not yours, right? And it's like, well, I think that's where we need to find that empathy again. This was my experience and this experience wasn't right. And so it shouldn't be the experience for anyone else coming after me. That's where we need to get to.
April, your insights today have been transformative, sincerely. Thank you for helping us understand not just the importance of those trauma-informed workplaces, but also how we can all be a part of the solution.
And to our listeners, remember, creating a trauma-informed workplace doesn't happen overnight. It starts with conversations like this. So if you've been inspired by today's episode, take a moment to reflect on what steps you can take, whether it's advocating for change, supporting a colleague, or simply listening with empathy.
And we'll include information in the show notes on how you can connect with April and her work. And you can connect with us, Matt and Lucy, Mind the Gap, on Leadify, Spotify, and YouTube channels, as well as their social media platforms.
Thank you again, April, for being here and sharing yourself and your expertise. And to everyone listening, keep minding the gap and building workplaces that care. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.